Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, June 14, 1963. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Rittenhouse Square as 17-year-old Michael Thomas Carson adjusted the focus ring on his brand-new Minolta SR7 camera, a graduation gift from his parents that still smelled of fresh leather and possibility. He was crouched behind a park bench, trying to capture the perfect shot of a pigeon landing on the bronze lion statue, completely unaware that the next click of his shutter would accidentally unravel one of the most carefully constructed Soviet intelligence operations on American soil. Michael believed he was simply practicing the photography techniques he had learned from his high school yearbook advisor, perfecting his timing and composition for what he hoped would be a portfolio strong enough to earn him a scholarship to the Rochester Institute of Technology. He had no way of knowing that within 72 hours, men in dark suits would be sitting in his family's modest dining room, examining every single frame of the film roll currently loaded in his camera, their faces grave with the weight of national security. What began as an innocent afternoon of amateur photography would transform into a case study taught for decades in counterintelligence training programs, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous exposures happen not in the shadows of espionage tradecraft, but in the brilliant, unforgiving light of an ordinary summer day. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Michael had been obsessed with photography since his uncle Walter returned from Korea with a battered Leica camera and stories about combat photographers who risked everything for the perfect shot. Unlike his older brother Thomas, who had dutifully enrolled in pre-law at Penn State, or his sister Elizabeth, who worked as a secretary at the First National Bank downtown, Michael saw the world through viewfinders and apertures, light and shadow. His bedroom walls were covered with photographs clipped from Life magazine, National Geographic, images by Henri Cartier-Bresson and Robert Capa that seemed to freeze not just moments, but entire emotional universes. His parents, Frank and Dorothy Carson, worried about their youngest child's artistic inclinations in a household that valued stability and practical careers, but they had scraped together $239 for the Minolta, hoping it might at least lead to steady work as a commercial photographer or perhaps photojournalism. That afternoon in Rittenhouse Square, Michael was working through a mental checklist his advisor, Mr. Patterson, had given him. Vary your angles, look for unexpected juxtapositions, wait for the decisive moment when all elements align. The park was moderately crowded for a Friday, office workers on lunch breaks sitting on benches eating sandwiches from wax paper, mothers pushing baby carriages along the gravel paths, elderly men playing chess at the stone tables near the fountain. Michael had already burned through 20 frames of his 36 exposure roll, capturing a businessman feeding sparrows, 2 children running through the spray of the fountain, an old woman knitting beneath a maple tree. He was particular about his shots, patient in a way that frustrated his friends who preferred the instant gratification of Polaroid cameras. He noticed the man in the grey suit around 2:15 in the afternoon, not because anything about him seemed suspicious, but because the light falling across his face created an interesting interplay of brightness and shadow. The man was perhaps 45 years old, average height, with dark hair beginning to grey at the temples and the kind of forgettable face that seemed designed to blend into crowds. He wore a charcoal suit that was well made but not expensive, a narrow tie in a muted blue, and carried a brown leather briefcase that looked worn from daily use. What caught Michael's photographic eye was the way the man stood perfectly still near the southeast corner of the park, his profile to the sun, creating what photographers call Rembrandt lighting, that distinctive triangle of light on the shadowed side of the face. Michael raised his camera slowly, adjusting his position to include in the frame not just the man, but also the ornate Victorian lamppost behind him and a portion of the park's wrought iron fence. Through his viewfinder, he could see the man checking his watch, then looking toward the street with what appeared to be casual patience. The scene felt balanced, compositionally interesting. The kind of candid street photography that Mr. Patterson encouraged. Michael waited, his finger hovering over the shutter release, practicing the breathing technique he had learned, waiting for that indefinable moment when everything aligned. Then something unexpected happened. A second man approached from the opposite direction, younger, perhaps in his early 30s, wearing a tan jacket and carrying a rolled newspaper under his arm. The younger man paused at the fence, perhaps 3 feet from the man in the grey suit, and seemed to study the flower beds. For exactly 7 seconds, neither man acknowledged the other's presence. Then, with a movement so subtle Michael almost missed it, the younger man placed his newspaper on the flat top of the fence post, said something brief and walked away. The man in the grey suit waited another 5 seconds, picked up the newspaper, tucked it under his arm, and began walking in the opposite direction. Michael clicked the shutter at the exact instant when the man in the grey suit reached for the newspaper. He had been so focused on the lighting and composition that the actual content of the scene, the possible significance of what he was witnessing, did not register in his conscious mind. He was simply capturing an interesting moment. 2 strangers in a park, the geometric lines of fence and lamppost, the quality of afternoon light filtering through maple leaves. He advanced the film, took one more shot of a dog walker passing by, and decided he had enough for the day. His film was nearly finished anyway, just 4 frames remaining, and he wanted to save those for the weekend when his family was planning a trip to Valley Forge. The darkroom at Philadelphia High School for Creative and Performing Arts, where Michael spent most of his free periods, smelled of chemicals and possibility. He had gotten permission from Mr. Patterson to use the facilities during summer break, part of an informal arrangement where Michael helped maintain the equipment in exchange for access. On Monday morning, June 17th, he arrived at 7:30, eager to develop the role from Friday. The school was mostly empty, just custodial staff and a few teachers preparing for summer programs. Michael worked alone in the comfortable darkness, the amber safe light casting everything in a warm, surreal glow. The developing process was ritualistic, almost meditative. He loaded the film into the developing tank in complete darkness, his fingers moving by touch and practice, then began the precise timing of developer, stop bath, and fixer. While the negatives dried, he prepared the enlarger, setting up trays of chemicals for the printing process. When he finally examined the dried negatives through a loupe, holding the strip up to the light, he was pleased with what he saw. Sharp focus, good exposure, interesting compositions. The frame with the 2 men in the park looked particularly promising, the lighting exactly what he had hoped for. He selected 5 negatives to print, including the park scene, and began the enlargement process. As the image materialized in the developing tray, emerging gradually from blankness into clarity, Michael felt the familiar thrill of watching his vision become tangible. But as he studied the print more carefully, transferring it to the stop bath and then the fixer, something nagged at his attention. In the background of the shot, barely visible but present, was a third person he had not noticed while shooting. A woman in a dark dress standing perhaps 20 feet behind the main subjects, her face turned toward the 2 men, holding something in her hand that caught the light. Binoculars, perhaps, or a small camera. Michael made another print, this time cropping in closer to the 2 main figures, eliminating the distracting background elements. The close-up revealed details his eye had not registered through the viewfinder. The newspaper being transferred was rolled tightly, secured with what looked like a rubber band. The younger man's hand position was awkward, almost formal, as if the gesture had been practiced. And something about the older man's expression, caught in that frozen instant, suggested not casual interaction, but intense concentration masked by apparent indifference. He pinned the prints to the drying line and began cleaning up, his mind already moving ahead to the next roll of film, the weekend trip, the portfolio he was slowly building. The image of the 2 men became just another print among dozens hanging in the darkroom, notable only for its lighting, soon to be filed away in a portfolio box with his other work. The knock on the Carson family's front door came at 6:47 on Wednesday evening, June 19th. Michael's father answered to find 2 men in dark suits, one holding a leather credential case that identified him as Special Agent William Hartley of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Philadelphia Field Office. The other man did not offer a name. They asked politely but firmly if they could speak with Michael Thomas Carson regarding a matter of national security. The words seemed to hang in the humid evening air, like something from a television drama. completely disconnected from the reality of their quiet street in the Germantown neighborhood. Dorothy Carson gripped the back of the dining room chair so hard, her knuckles whitened as the agents explained why they were there. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had been conducting surveillance on an individual suspected of espionage activities, they explained, carefully watching their words. This individual had been photographed in Rittenhouse Square on the afternoon of June 14th. They had reason to believe that Michael Carson had also been present in the park that day with a camera. They needed to examine any photographs he had taken. Michael sat frozen, his mind racing through that afternoon, trying to understand how his innocent photography session had intersected with something so serious. Yes, he told them, he had been in Rittenhouse Square that day. Yes, he had taken photographs. Yes, he had developed the film. The prints were upstairs in his room. Special Agent Hartley asked very carefully if anyone else had seen these photographs or if Michael had shown them to anyone. No, Michael said. Just him. He had developed them on Monday and had not shown them to anyone yet. The agent who had not given his name went upstairs with Michael to retrieve not just the prints but also the negatives, the entire roll of film, everything. When they returned to the dining room, both agents examined the prints carefully under the overhead light, their faces betraying nothing. Then Special Agent Hartley looked at Michael with an expression that mixed severity with something that might have been sympathy, and said the words that would dominate the Carson household for weeks to come. Everything Michael had seen, everything they were about to tell him, fell under national security restrictions. He could not discuss these photographs with anyone, not friends, not extended family, not teachers. Any violation of this instruction could result in prosecution under federal law. What they explained next seemed impossible, like the plot of one of the spy novels Michael's brother read. The man in the grey suit was Viktor Alexandrovich Petrov, a Soviet intelligence officer, working under diplomatic cover at the United Nations in New York City. For the past 11 months, the Federal Bureau of Investigation had been running a counterintelligence operation, tracking Petrov's activities in Philadelphia, where he had been making regular trips, supposedly to visit historical sites, but actually to meet with a network of individuals passing classified information from defense contractors in the region. The younger man in the park, whose identity they did not reveal to Michael, was part of this network, a courier who had been under surveillance for months. But here was the crucial detail, the reason they were sitting in the Carson dining room. The Federal Bureau of Investigation surveillance team had lost visual contact with Petrov for approximately 45 minutes that afternoon, due to an equipment malfunction in their vehicle. They had photographic evidence of him arriving at the park and leaving the park, but no direct documentation of the actual meeting, the exchange of materials, the specific moment when intelligence might have changed hands. Without that proof, building a prosecutable case would be significantly more difficult. Michael's photograph, accidentally captured, potentially provided the missing link. The unnamed agent produced a magnifying glass from his briefcase and examined Michael's print with intense focus. He pointed to details Michael had not fully appreciated. The unusual way the newspaper was rolled, suggesting something might be concealed inside it, the formal, almost ritualistic nature of the exchange, and most intriguingly, the woman in the background whom Michael had barely noticed. The agents exchanged glances. They would need to take the negatives and prints, they explained, for technical analysis and possible use in legal proceedings. Michael would receive a receipt. He would likely be called to testify about the circumstances under which the photographs were taken. And again, they emphasized, he could not discuss any of this with anyone. After the agents left, the Carson family sat in stunned silence at the dining table, their dinner of meatloaf and mashed potatoes grown cold and forgotten. Frank Carson, a shipping clerk who had served in World War II but never discussed it, looked at his youngest son with an expression Michael could not quite interpret. Pride, perhaps, or worry, or both. Dorothy kept saying, as if repetition might make it less surreal, that her boy had accidentally photographed a Soviet spy. Elizabeth, practical and skeptical by nature, asked the question none of them wanted to voice. If Michael had accidentally captured evidence the Federal Bureau of Investigation needed, did that mean he had also made himself visible to dangerous people, to the very spy ring he had unwittingly documented. The technical analysis of Michael's negatives took place in a laboratory at Federal Bureau of Investigation headquarters in Washington, where specialists in photographic intelligence examined every detail. Using high-resolution enlargers and enhancement techniques, they extracted information from the image that would have been invisible to the casual observer. The newspaper being exchanged was identified by its distinctive masthead as the Philadelphia Evening Bulletin, the afternoon edition from June 13th, one day before the photographed exchange. This was significant because it suggested premeditation, the newspaper selected and prepared in advance, likely hollowed out to contain documents or microfilm, a technique known in intelligence circles as a concealment device. The woman in the background, initially dismissed as a random bystander, became a subject of intense scrutiny. Enhancement of that portion of the negative revealed she was indeed holding a small camera, what appeared to be a subminiature Minox, the preferred tool of espionage photography. Her position and posture suggested she was photographing the two men, documenting the exchange for purposes unknown. This raised troubling questions. Was she part of the Soviet operation, creating insurance or documentation? Was she a third-party observer from another intelligence service? Or was she, like Michael, simply someone in the wrong place at the wrong time, an amateur photographer whose interest happened to overlap with espionage? The Federal Bureau of Investigation launched an intensive investigation to identify the woman. They compiled every photograph taken by their surveillance teams in Rittenhouse Square over the previous months, looking for any appearance of this individual. They checked registration records from nearby hotels, reviewed passenger lists from trains arriving from New York and Washington, cross-referenced faces against known intelligence operatives from multiple countries. The search was complicated by the fact that Michael's photograph captured only her profile, partially obscured by shadow, showing a woman of medium height with dark hair pulled back, wearing a dress and coat typical of the era, nothing particularly distinguishing. While this investigation unfolded, Michael's life continued in a strange state of enforced normalcy. He could not tell his friends why he seemed distracted, could not explain to Mr. Patterson why he suddenly seemed less enthusiastic about photography, could not share with his girlfriend Susan the reason he jumped every time the telephone rang. He went on the planned family trip to Valley Forge that weekend, took photographs of the historic buildings and monuments, but found himself constantly scanning the background of his viewfinder, wondering who else might be watching, who else might be documenting moments he thought were private. The legal case against Viktor Petrov and his network began to take shape through that summer of 1963. Michael's photograph became Exhibit 47 in a classified legal brief, reproduced and analyzed, its metadata carefully documented. The Federal Bureau of Investigation needed to establish what lawyers called chain of custody, proving that the image was authentic, unaltered, taken at the time and place claimed. Michael was interviewed repeatedly, asked to describe in minute detail everything he remembered about that afternoon, what time he arrived at the park, what his sequence of shots had been, why he had chosen to photograph those particular men, whether he had noticed anything unusual. In late July, Michael was brought to the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office in downtown Philadelphia for what they called a viewing session. In a windowless conference room, he was shown surveillance photographs of Viktor Petrov from multiple dates and locations, some taken with long telephoto lenses, others from hidden cameras. The agents wanted to confirm that the man in Michael's photograph was definitively the same individual they had been tracking. Michael studied the images, noting the distinctive way Petrov wore his tie slightly loose, the particular angle of his shoulders, the pattern of his walk. Yes, he confirmed, that was the man he had photographed in Rittenhouse Square. Then they showed him something that made his stomach tighten with anxiety. It was a photograph of Michael himself, taken in Rittenhouse Square on June 14th, shot from across the street with a telephoto lens. In the image, he was clearly visible holding his Minolta camera, aiming it toward the area where Petrov and the courier had met. The photograph was grainy but unmistakable. The timestamp written on the back indicated it had been taken at 2:17 in the afternoon, within minutes of Michael's shot. The agents explained that this image had been found during a search of an apartment rented by a known Soviet intelligence operative, part of the support network for Petrov's operation. Michael had not just photographed the spies had photographed him. This revelation transformed everything. The Federal Bureau of Investigation could no longer treat Michael as merely a fortunate witness who had accidentally documented evidence. He was now potentially known to a hostile intelligence service, identifiable, possibly targeted. Special Agent Hartley was straightforward about the implications. It was unlikely, but not impossible, that Soviet intelligence might try to locate him, either to determine if he was actually a witness to their operation or if he was part of a deeper counterintelligence effort. For his safety and the integrity of ongoing investigations, certain precautions needed to be taken. For the remainder of that summer, Michael lived with a low-level paranoia that never quite left him. The Federal Bureau of Investigation advised against routines, suggested varying his routes and schedules, told him to be alert for anyone showing unusual interest in him or his family. His parents worried constantly. His father, remembering his own service in wartime, seemed to age visibly under the weight of knowing his son had stumbled into something dangerous. His mother insisted on knowing where Michael was at all times, called him home early from any social activities, treated every unknown car on their street as a potential threat. The woman in the background of Michael's photograph was never identified. Despite extensive investigation, she remained a ghost, a mystery figure whose purpose and affiliation could not be determined. Some Federal Bureau of Investigation analysts believed she was part of the Soviet support network, documenting the exchange for Moscow's files. Others theorized she might have been from a third intelligence service, perhaps British or Israeli, running their own observation of Petrov's activities. A minority opinion suggested she might have been exactly what she appeared to be, an amateur photographer who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, whose interest in street photography had coincidentally overlapped with espionage, just as Michael's had. The legal proceedings against Viktor Petrov and his network extended into 1964. Petrov himself, protected by diplomatic immunity, was quietly expelled from the United States in September of 1963, declared persona non grata, and given 72 hours to leave the country. The courier captured in Michael's photograph, a man named Robert Edwin Marsh, was arrested in August and charged with conspiracy to commit espionage. Marsh, it emerged, worked as a technical writer for a defense contractor in suburban Philadelphia that manufactured components for naval sonar systems. He had been passing documents to Petrov for an estimated 14 months in exchange for payments totaling approximately $18,000. Michael was subpoenaed to testify before a grand jury in October. In a federal courthouse in downtown Philadelphia, in a closed session from which even family members were excluded, he recounted the events of June 14th under oath. He described his position in the park, the camera settings he had used, the exact moment he had clicked the shutter. The prosecutors projected enlarged versions of his photograph on a screen, asking him to identify specific details, to confirm that this was indeed the image he had captured. The defense attorney for Robert Marsh challenged the photograph's authenticity, suggested it might have been staged or altered, questioned whether a 17-year-old with a new camera could have possibly captured such a clear and detailed image under those conditions. To address these challenges, the Federal Bureau of Investigation brought in its chief photographic analyst, a man named Dr. Eugene Winters, who had 30 years of experience in forensic photography. Dr. Winters testified for nearly 4 hours, explaining in technical detail how he had examined the negative, how the grain structure and tonal relationships proved it was an original, unmanipulated image, how the characteristics of the film emulsion were consistent with the Minolta camera and the lighting conditions Michael described. He demonstrated how the slight graininess in the image was actually proof of its authenticity, showing it had been shot at the relatively high film speed that would be necessary for handheld photography in outdoor shade. The grand jury returned indictments in November. Robert Marsh would eventually be convicted of espionage-related charges in February of 1964 and sentenced to 23 years in federal prison. 2 other individuals in the network, whose identities were never made public, received sentences of varying length. Viktor Petrov returned to Moscow, where, according to later defector reports, He was initially praised for his intelligence work, but eventually fell under suspicion for allowing his operation to be compromised. The paranoid logic of Soviet intelligence blamed him for the unraveling of his own network, despite the fact that the exposure had come through an accident he could not have anticipated or prevented. For Michael Carson, the experience fundamentally changed his relationship with photography. He continued taking pictures, eventually did receive a scholarship to study photojournalism, but he never again looked through a viewfinder without awareness of the weight that a single captured moment could carry. The casual innocence of amateur photography had been replaced by a profound understanding that every photograph was a choice with consequences, that documenting reality meant becoming part of the reality being documented. In 1967, after graduating with honors in photojournalism, Michael took a job with a small newspaper in central Pennsylvania. He deliberately chose not to pursue work with major publications in New York or Washington, preferring the relative anonymity of covering local news, high school sports, county fairs, and municipal meetings. His colleagues knew him as talented but peculiarly cautious, someone who always asked permission before photographing anyone, who seemed almost apologetic about the intrusion of his camera. They did not know, because he could not tell them, that this caution was born from having accidentally documented espionage, from having learned at 17 that a photograph could become evidence in a federal prosecution, that the act of seeing and recording could make you visible to forces you did not understand. The Minolta SR7 camera remained in his equipment bag for years, but was gradually replaced by newer models as technology advanced. In 1989, after the fall of the Berlin Wall signaled the beginning of the end of the Cold War, Michael received an unexpected letter from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The classification on his case file had been partially lifted, they informed him, and certain materials could now be returned to him, including the original prints and negatives from June of 1963. The letter thanked him for his cooperation and noted that his photograph had been used in counterintelligence training programs for more than 2 decades as an example of how valuable intelligence could come from unexpected sources. Michael retrieved the materials from the Federal Bureau of Investigation field office on a cold afternoon in November of that year. Sitting in his car in the parking lot, he opened the envelope and examined the prints for the first time in 26 years. The image looked smaller than he remembered, less dramatic, just 2 men in a park on a summer afternoon, frozen in a moment that now seemed impossibly distant. The woman in the background, the mysterious figure who had never been identified, remained exactly as she had been in 1963, watching, documenting, her purpose unknown. Michael wondered if she had been like him, an accidental witness, or if she had been a professional, someone for whom espionage was not an accident, but a calling. The question of whether the woman had also photographed Michael, whether somewhere in a file in Moscow or London or Tel Aviv, there existed an image of a 17-year-old boy with a new camera accidentally documenting a spy exchange, was one he would never have answered. It remained one of many loose ends from that summer, mysteries that the end of the Cold War would partially illuminate, but never fully resolve. In his later years, teaching photography at a community college and occasionally doing freelance work for regional magazines, Michael would sometimes use his own story, carefully edited to remove classified details, as a cautionary tale for his students. He would talk about the ethics of photography, about the responsibility that came with the power to capture and freeze moments, about the ways that photographers inevitably became part of the stories they documented. He would emphasize that every photograph was both a record and an interpretation, that the act of choosing what to include in a frame and what to exclude was itself a form of testimony. What he rarely discussed, even decades later, was the way that experience had taught him about the invisible architecture of the Cold War, the realization that the great ideological struggle between superpowers was not fought only in Berlin or Vienna or Korea, but also in quiet American parks, in unremarkable exchanges between forgettable-looking men, in the spaces between official history and lived experience. His photograph had documented not just an espionage exchange, but a tiny fragment of a vast hidden conflict that touched millions of lives in ways they would never know. The woman in the photograph, the mystery observer who was never identified, became in Michael's mind a symbol of all the unknown watchers, all the people engaged in secret competitions and covert observations, all the individuals whose purposes remained obscure even when their presence was documented. He would sometimes wonder if she had known she was being photographed, if somewhere in her own collection of images there existed a photograph of him photographing her, photographing the exchange, an infinite regress of observation and documentation, each observer unaware of all the others. By the time Michael retired in 2008, the world of espionage had been transformed by digital technology, satellite surveillance, and electronic communications. The tradecraft of dead drops and park bench exchanges seemed quaint, almost nostalgic, relics of an analog age. But the fundamental principles remained unchanged. Information still needed to be secretly transmitted. Operations still required documentation, and accidents still happened. Young people with cameras still unknowingly captured evidence of things they were not meant to see. The tools changed, but the essential human dimensions of intelligence work, the physical meetings and vulnerable exchanges, persisted. Michael died in 2019 at the age of 73, of complications from pneumonia. His collection of photographs, thousands of images documenting more than 50 years of American life, was donated to the Historical Society in the small Pennsylvania town where he had spent most of his career. The famous photograph from Rittenhouse Square, no longer classified but never widely published, was included in the collection, accompanied by a brief note explaining its significance. Museum visitors would occasionally pause before it, studying the image of two men and trying to see in their faces and postures the evidence of espionage, the markers of secret exchange, the visible signs of hidden purpose. But what made the photograph historically significant was not visible in the image itself. It was the surrounding context, the accidental nature of its creation, the reminder that intelligence work, despite all its planning and professionalism, remained vulnerable to chance, to the unpredictable intersection of secret operations and innocent activities. It documented the moment when an amateur photographer's artistic instincts accidentally aligned with a counterintelligence investigation, when the desire to capture interesting light happened to coincide with a covert exchange of classified materials. The Federal Bureau of Investigation trainers who used the photograph in their classes emphasized this lesson. Even the most carefully planned operation could be compromised by factors beyond the operative's control. They could not account for every camera in every park, could not predict when an interested observer might choose that exact moment to click a shutter. The professionalization of intelligence work, the elaborate protocols and security measures, could be undone by the amateur enthusiasm of a teenager excited about his new camera. In the decades after Michael's death, researchers seeking to write comprehensive histories of Cold War espionage would occasionally discover references to his photograph in declassified documents. They would piece together fragments of the story, interview former Federal Bureau of Investigation agents who remembered the case, construct narratives about how a 17-year-old's graduation gift had helped expose a Soviet intelligence network. But the full story, with all its human complexity and emotional weight, the fear and confusion that had dominated the Carson household that summer of 1963, would remain largely inaccessible, known only to those who had lived through it. The Minolta SR7 camera, the instrument that had accidentally documented espionage, was sold at an estate sale after Michael's death for $45. The buyer, a college student interested in vintage photography equipment, had no idea of its history. The camera worked perfectly, its mechanical precision unchanged by decades of use. It would continue to capture images, completely indifferent to whether those images were historically significant or merely personal, art or evidence, intentional or accidental. The camera did not care about the meaning of what it recorded. It simply saw what was placed before its lens, preserved what light and chemistry allowed, and left the interpretation to others. The unidentified woman in the background of the photograph remained the greatest mystery of the case. Despite periodic reviews of the file over the decades, despite advances in facial recognition technology that were eventually applied to her profile, she was never conclusively identified. She existed in the permanent record only as a shadowy figure, watching watchers, documenting documenters. her purpose and affiliation forever uncertain. She became, in intelligence community discussions, a reminder of how much remained unknown even in cases that were supposedly solved, how every answer generated new questions, how the layers of observation and counter-observation in espionage work sometimes extended beyond the ability to track or comprehend. For the Carson family, the experience had lasting effects that rippled through years. Elizabeth became suspicious of strangers and cameras, developed a mild paranoia about surveillance that she never entirely shook. Thomas, who had been away at college during most of the events, felt oddly resentful that his younger brother had stumbled into something significant while he was studying contract law and living an ordinary life. Frank and Dorothy never spoke about it, except in the vaguest terms, as if silence could retroactively protect their son from dangers that had already passed. The broader historical significance of Michael's photograph extended beyond the specific case it documented. It became a teaching tool, an illustration of principles that intelligence professionals needed to understand. Every operation, no matter how carefully planned, existed in a public space where ordinary citizens might observe and record. The growth of consumer photography in the 1950s and 60s, the proliferation of cameras in amateur hands, created millions of potential witnesses, millions of devices capable of capturing evidence. Intelligence services had to adapt to a world where surveillance was no longer monopolized by professionals, where anyone might accidentally document something significant. This democratization of surveillance would accelerate dramatically in later decades with the advent of digital cameras, cell phone cameras, and social media. But in 1963, Michael's Minolta represented an early example of how consumer technology could intersect with national security, how the tools of personal expression and memory-making could accidentally become instruments of intelligence gathering. His experience foreshadowed a future where the boundary between amateur and professional observation would become increasingly blurred, where the distinction between private photography and state surveillance would grow more complicated. The afternoon in Rittenhouse Square, that ordinary summer day when a teenager tried to capture good lighting and accidentally photographed a spy exchange, became a small but significant moment in the hidden history of the Cold War. It demonstrated how the vast ideological struggle between superpowers was conducted not just through grand strategic moves, but through countless small encounters, secret exchanges, and accidental exposures. It showed how history was made not only by presidents and spy masters, but also by ordinary people whose innocent activities happened to intersect with extraordinary events. Michael Carson never sought recognition for his accidental contribution to counterintelligence. He never wrote a memoir or gave interviews about his experience. The classified nature of the case for so many years, followed by his own reluctance to exploit what he viewed as an accident rather than an achievement, kept the story largely unknown. He preferred to be remembered, if at all, as a competent photographer who had documented his community faithfully for 5 decades, who had taught countless students the technical and ethical dimensions of photography, who had lived a quiet life defined more by what he chose to see than by what he accidentally captured. But in the archives of American intelligence history, in the training materials used to educate new generations of counterintelligence officers, in the declassified files that scholars would eventually examine, his photograph remained. It stood as evidence that chance and intention were not always easily separated, that the most significant observations were sometimes the unplanned ones, that a teenager's enthusiasm for photography and a spy's need for secrecy had collided in a park on a summer afternoon, with consequences neither could have predicted. The final irony of the story was that Michael's photograph, taken to practice technique and capture interesting light, was in some ways more valuable as intelligence than it was as art. The composition was decent but not exceptional, the lighting good but not remarkable, the subject matter accidentally interesting rather than intentionally profound. Its significance came entirely from context, from the fact that it documented something that was not meant to be seen, that it provided evidence the proper authorities needed but had failed to capture. The photograph's value was forensic rather than aesthetic, its importance historical rather than artistic. Yet in another sense, the photograph exemplified what all meaningful photography does. It preserved a moment of truth, captured reality in a way that allowed others to see what had happened, provided testimony about the world as it actually was. Whether that truth was about light and shadow or espionage and betrayal did not change the fundamental function of photography as a form of witness. Michael Carson, at 17, had become an accidental witness to history, and his camera had faithfully recorded what he saw, indifferent to the consequences that would follow. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.